My name is Matlu Paracha.
Got it.
My name is Matlu Paracha. I'm the director of GLO. And it is my pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, David, aka Danny Blanchflower, who doesn't really need any introduction, really. Danny is a renowned labor economist with significant contributions in different aspects of the field. In terms of his affiliations, Danny is a professor of economics at Dartmouth College, part-time professor of economics at Glasgow University, research associate at the NBAR, Bloomberg TV contributing editor. He was a member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee from 2006 to 2009. And perhaps most importantly, he is GLO's research director. And in terms of his research impact, there's a very long list. I won't go through the whole thing, but just to kind of point out two main things. Danny is universally acknowledged as the happiness guru. Of course, the title he acquired because of his several significant contributions on happiness research, often challenging the established orthodoxy in this psychology literature. And among many other contributions is his seminal work on the wage curve back in the 1990s. I was actually just talking to my students about that yesterday. Okay, so I can go on for another hour, but I'll stop here and I'll give the virtual floor to Danny, who's going to talk about the economics of walking about, a term he coined during his time at the Bank of England, I think in 2007, if I'm not mistaken, and how walking about could be used to predict unemployment. Danny will answer your questions at the end, so please mute your mics until then. But feel free to put any questions in the chat as we go along. Danny, over to you.
Great, thank you. Let me try and share my screen. Hopefully we can see it. Can we see that picture of me fishing? Can you see that?
We can see that, yeah.
Great.
We see a fish. Well, we see a fish, okay.
We see a fish. Hopefully that's what you all should see. Right, well, thank you so much. I mean, this is actually, I think, pretty interesting stuff. In a way, it works on wage curves and happiness and so on. So this is a series of papers that I want to talk about. And I want you to think of them essentially as papers on happiness. So this is sort of macro happiness, and it's trying to use data to think about calling recessions and to think about this. I'm going to give a talk actually in a couple of weeks, and I'm going to call it The Well-Being of the Man or Woman on the Mile End Road Omnibus. And the reason for doing that, the story used to be that you should care about the well-being of the man or woman on the Clapham Omnibus, but in London that's become quite a sort of yuppified place. So the Mile End Road is actually a pretty important place. The reason it's called Mile End is it's a mile from the City of London. So it's about what people outside the City of London, normal people. But the bottom line here is not only should you care about the well-being of the man or woman on the Berlin omnibus, on the, whatever omnibus, but you should actually care about what they say. And this is crucial. So this is sort of well-being. But essentially this is about, so you can see this set of papers. This is about the fear of unemployment, particularly. It's about fear of unemployment, and it's about people's expectations of what's coming. So this is a whole area of research. I first started working on that, as you see, in 1991. And I have another paper on the fear of migration. But this sort of comes from early work that I did when I was at the Bank of England, trying to think about, could you call recessions? So this is actually about the fact that ask the person on the Mile End Road Omnibus what they think is coming. And it turns out through all of these papers that does a much better job than the entirety of the macroeconomics profession. It does better than the entirety of forecasting people. And if you'd have been tracking this stuff since about 2006, you would have called the Great Recession. And in fact, I can show you in the United States, if you looked at these data, you would have called all 6 of the prior recessions in the United States ahead of anybody else. You'd have called it ahead of the NBAR, the NBAR dating committee by probably about a year. You'd have called it earlier. And I'm going to end up showing you that based upon these data, it looks today that the United States has entered recession in the peak of the previous boom was the second quarter of 2002. So obviously these are bold claims, and I want to just show you a few things and particularly get to the third. So the first paper is actually an NBR and a GLO paper. The second one is coming as a GLO paper, but it's already been taken at the National Institute of Economic Review. And the third one, which we're about to finish today, I'm going to talk about, and we're just waiting for the conference board. So this is data that is publicly available, but I want to encourage you that this is really pretty interesting new stuff. So this sort of comes from, this came from basically the first time I really realized this was in a speech that I made in April 2008, based upon these data. So remember, I want to have in people's heads that basically by September 2008, the ECB, the Bank of England, and the Fed still had no clue that basically the US went into recession in December 2007, and almost every other country, certainly in Europe, went into recession in April of 2008. So this is a quote that I made saying that I thought in April 2008, based upon the data that I'm going to show you, that the US went into recession, I said in December 07, which turned out to be correct. And I also said that I thought that at the time, I thought on the basis of these data that the UK went into recession in April 2008. And that turned out also to be correct. So with hindsight, if you look back, I kind of had it. And I want to show you a few things and show you that now we can go forward and show that in fact, a lot of what we're going to show is you can use these data, not just for the UK. And this paper actually shows you that you can use these data, which is actually panel data, month by year data for 29 European countries. So every European country, essentially, all the major ones and the UK too. And we're going to I use those data based upon a thing called the fear of unemployment, which is what I started out in 1991. And you ask people, what do you think is going to happen to unemployment over the next 6 to 12 months? Literally that. And then also it turns out that there are surveys that the European Union does where they ask employers the same thing. So I'm thinking about people's happiness, but I'm also thinking of happiness amongst firms. And it turns out those two things are highly correlated. So we also have data by month, by year for all of these countries on construction, retail, services and manufacturing. And they ask employers, what do you think is going to happen to employment over the next 6 months or so? And it turns out that those things are very highly correlated, which is pretty interesting. And consumers seem to track extremely well what employers say. So it turns out that's obviously a big question. What is it that people know? And the answer is they probably know, using what I call the economics of walking about, what's going on. And I've written a lot about that. So anyway, so here's the stuff in the European Union, which is on the fear of unemployment. We don't have that in the United States, but we have something comparable that I'll get to. But essentially, we have surveys in the US, both at the University of Michigan and the Conference Board, where people are asked, what do you think is going to happen to employment and other things, to the economy and stuff, over the next 6 to 12 months. And it turns out these are more important. These surveys are much more important than anything macro forecasters are doing. You basically just need to look at this, I can show you. And that's really what you need to know. And it has two benefits, two great benefits. The first is that you get it in a very timely way. So in the European Union, if you want data for August 2021, you get it on the 26th of August 2021. You actually get data for that month in that month. So they take the survey in the first 2 weeks and they tell you it in the third week. Okay, so that's the first thing. And the second thing is the data don't get revised, which is one of the big issues we're going to come to. And essentially the reason that most macro forecasters and policymakers, and many of whom I'm listening to over the last few days, say completely stupid, idiotic things, is they have no clue kind of where they are, and they have no clue what's going to happen to the revisions, and they have no clue what's going to happen to the revisions of the past, and they should be looking at this stuff. So what I'm going to show you is that using these data, you can track all the recessions that occurred in Europe, and in the US, I can show you we can track very well all of the 6 recessions that occurred better than anybody else can using these data. So these are bold claims. So here's essentially what we're going to do. So we're going to look at a thing called the Psalm rule. I'm sure if people know what it is, it's you can look at it on Fred in the United States. Turns out, I'm afraid, despite the fact that Claudia Sahm is kind of an interesting person, it turns out that the Sahm rule is worthless. The Sahm rule doesn't work in any country outside the United States. It always occurs after the recession has started, and it always occurs after my index predicts what's coming. So it doesn't apply to any country outside the US, perhaps to Canada, but not to a single European country. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But it turns out in the United States that you actually can forecast recession really pretty well. And I'm going to do all of this together, but we'll start with Europe in a sec. But here's what I'm going to end up getting to. In the US, you can actually predict recession pretty well by not two successive quarterly drops in GDP. Basically what you should, sometimes they alternate. So imagine you have a negative quarter, a positive quarter, and a negative quarter. That I'm going to count that as 2 out of 3. It's the same. Imagine if you have 3 out of 3, or the first 2 or the last, that's fine. But 2 out of 3 successive quarters of negative GDP growth is what you need. Actually, it turns out that 2 successive months of negative employment growth is actually a really pretty darn good indicator. The third thing is, does unemployment in a single month jump by 0.3? So from 5.2 to 5.5, all of those things work pretty well. Unfortunately, right now, none of them work. None of these work because the labor market data is completely messed up in the Great Recession. And unemployment just turns out to be falling. It's a bad measure. It's falling. Employment growth is rising, but you'll see that if those 3 things are not any use right now. But the other one, I should have said this, the other thing is that what you need, and I'm going to show you this right now and give you a call, which we're going to make this week, which is that if you take the University of Michigan so-called expectations index, or you take the Conference Board's index and you say it drops 20 points, that turns out to date the start of the recession in the US to around May of this year. And we'll talk more about that. Okay, can I just take you, I've got a lot of slides and I'm going to try and get through fairly quickly and just show you a couple of regressions and show you, go through the story because there's quite a lot of pictures. The time path of all of this stuff is pretty useful. So this is what I knew in 2007. And essentially, this is what I knew in April 2008. This is literally the data that I had as a policymaker setting interest rates on April the 28th, 2008. What did I know? And here's what I know. If you look at here, and you can go to the speech and I provide these data for you. So remember that the Fed by September 2008, when Lehman Brothers failed, had basically still not understood that the US had gone into recession. You can read the minutes of their meeting, they still hadn't got it. And in fact, the NBR doesn't call the start of the recession, which they call eventually for 2007 December. They don't call it until December 2008, right? So here's what I said. Look at this. So what you find first off is that things in the housing market start to collapse from the beginning of 2006. Then it turns out, and this is sort of crucial, then it turns out by around January, February 2007, both the 2 indices that I'm going to talk to you about, both of those indices turns out reach a peak is around January, February of 2007. And then the thing starts to spread. So the non-farm payrolls start to decline in July 07. Hourly earnings start to decline in September 07. And in fact, there's in the end, real consumption starts falling in October 07. And by December 07, the unemployment rate starts to rise. Remember that September 2008, the Fed still didn't understand that, right? And so that's the starting point. And then if you go to the UK, I'm sorry, go back. If you go to the UK, and why I want to set this up, if you go to the UK, exactly the same process occurred. So these processes I'm going to show you in these data basically track each other very well across countries, across data sources. This is sort of unique stuff. This is the economics of walking about. This is asking people what's going on. Same thing happens in the UK. 2007, the housing market starts to decline. September, October 2007, consumer confidence starts to fall. It goes through to other measures of the labor market in around 07. Employment PMI start to fall in October 07. And then eventually unemployment and employment change, and the Sahm rule gets you to August 08. But essentially it's clear in these data that you get, I called, and it's clear if you look back, it's clear by, certainly by the start of 08 that the US is headed to recession. So these data, and again in the UK, nobody had got this. Nobody understood. I mean, I was fighting a lone battle, and I kept saying the US was in recession, UK was in recession, but basically I wasn't really being listened to. And but very quickly I went from goat to guru, because for a long time I was a goat. Anyway, let me just show you a couple of things, a couple more things. And this is why all of this stuff is really important. The reason why policymakers get screwed up is because, I say it again, you're trying to make a forecast. And I listen to Fed governors. I listened to Bill Dudley, who wrote an article this morning, which I thought was ludicrous nonsense about what the Fed ought to be doing and where we're going. And in 3 months, we ought to. He hasn't the faintest clue. And here's the problem. So essentially what happens is, I said to you, policymakers don't know where you've been, they don't know where you're going, and they don't know where you are. The problem is when you get to turning points, and this is me trying to think about, can you use the economics of walking about to tell you about turning points? So Ira's going to like this. This is for Ira. So I kept saying in this April 08 speech that the U.S.A. had gone into recession, right? And I got just destroyed in the press by this data release that I'm showing you. I got completely destroyed in the press. I made that speech saying the UK is in recession. And this data release came out on July the 25th or something on GDP growth Q2 08, plus 0.2. And I went, oh God, the headlines were like, Charles Goodhart says Blanchflower's an idiot, doesn't know what he's doing. You know, all of these clueless buffoons said, oh, look, it's all positive. Well, here's what happened. Think about a turning point. At a turning point, what happens is data comes in, and the initial data is basically dominantly a forecast. And then data comes in, and the balance between forecast and actual data changes. Well, think about a turning point. At a turning point, you just keep on forecasting that you're going to carry on upwards. So at this turning point, the plus 0.2, well, it turns out the actual true answer is minus 0.6. So you get plus 0.2, but the actual answer was minus 0.6. But it turns out that was the start of the Q208, was the start of the recession. But actually, if you look, it didn't go negative until June. So you got a negative for Q308 in October. You got a negative for Q408 in January 09. But in June 09, you suddenly realized that Blanchflower was right. And actually the recession started in April 08. But you didn't know that in the actual data until June 09. Everyone with it? So it turns out the same actually applies to upticks too. They do things in an uptick. So in a downturn, they're too optimistic. In an uptick, they're too pessimistic, but we don't really care in upticks. You know, we forecast output's going to grow by 0.2 and it grows by 2, whoopee, but they miss the turning point down. So this is sort of crucial. Same thing in the United States. So if you look here, you initially get data. Here's the US does it the UK and everywhere else does it quarterly growth. The US always does it annualized. So this is annualized times 4, right? And what it turns out, what it turns out if you look at the first quarter of 08, is that the first, second, and third readings, so these were the actual time readings, they were all positive, just like in the UK. The most recent thing, it turns it from the third reading with plus 1, it's now minus 1.6. So clearly what you need in the economics is that macro forecasters believe this nonsense. Macro forecasters have been doing this. And essentially the question you have to ask yourself is, why do the macro guys miss the Great Recession and miss every one of the recessions? And the answer is because they're looking at data that gets revised and they're not using their brains and looking at the economics of walking about. I tell a story which I thought illustrates it well. In January 2008, I was very worried. I gave a speech saying, got me into deep trouble, saying that my colleagues were fiddling while Rome burns. The economy was slowing fast. And I've done a whole series of radio and TV interviews. And I was in London, and I was, if you know Oxford Street, I was in Oxford Street, and I called a cab, and I got into the cab, and the cabbie looked at me, and he said, I know you, you're that bloke Blanchflower who keeps saying there's a recession, aren't you? I said, yeah. And he said, I got something to show you. He said, I've been driving up and down Oxford Street for 30 years. And he said, this is the first time I've seen this. And I said, well, seen what? He said, look around you. What do you see? And I said, I see shoppers. He said, yeah, but look, keep looking. Okay, I'm looking. And he said to me, he said, have you not spotted something? He said, for the first time in 30 years, none of them have got bags. They're just window shopping. Turns out that was a really good predictor of the decline in retail sales that was coming. And there's a whole series of papers all about this kind of economics of walking about. Things like sales of women's clothes. Turns out as the economy slows, my daughters with babies, they're not going to stop buying diapers. They're not going to stop buying things for their babies, but they stop buying dresses for themselves. So there's lots of this kind of stuff. Okay, how am I doing for time? I'm doing all right. I'm 20 minutes, about halfway through that. Yeah, I'm doing good.
Yeah, that's fine.
So here's the story I just want to get to. So in the end, it turns out that in the end in Europe, the GDP data is actually pretty good. So GDP data once revised. So now when we look back, 10 years later, turns out GDP is actually a pretty good predictor of where you started from. So if you look here across all these countries, pretty darn much using the GDP data and using 2 successive quarters, you basically get most countries starting Q208. So you get, so the green lines are the 2 successive quarters. You get Denmark, France, Germany, Greece, Italy, Japan, Portugal, and the UK, all starting Q2. And in Q3, you get Austria, Belgium, and so on. The US is a bit messy, and we have to worry about that. If you look at the bottom, Q407 was positive, Q108 was negative, Q208 was positive, and then so these 2 a quarter in the middle, which is kind of weird. All right. So what we use is this thing called the fear of unemployment in Europe. So the first thing in Europe is we try and take a fear of unemployment variable and try and show you, can you use that to forecast changes in the unemployment rate? I'm a labor market guy, started out in the early 80s working on unemployment. So I'm going to focus on unemployment, for all its ills. And I've written a lot about underemployment stuff. Turns out that it's something really hard to do. And Klaus and I have talked many times about this. It turns out to be really hard to model unemployment. So all of the stuff, you remember the Layard-Nickel model, the OECD job, all complete nonsense, complete and total nonsense, long-term, all utter nonsense, because the Blanchard-Wolf is nonsense, because everything gets killed off by the state and year fixed effects, just aggregation biases and missing variable biases. So when you try and run an unemployment equation, it's actually really hard. So, for example, you can't get unions to enter into an unemployment equation. You can't. You can't get types of collective bargaining to work. You can't get duration of unemployment benefits. And if anything, in the last 2 years, everything these guys used to say about job protection measures and union measures actually protected unemployment and lowered unemployment. So all of that literally was complete nonsense. And turns out it's really hard to actually get anything to enter an unemployment equation. So I'm going to show you the fear of unemployment, but something just as an aside. So I'm going to show you that this variable called the fear of unemployment enters unemployment equations. And in the US, these expectations of unemployment enter unemployment equations. And if you go look at the literature, basically nobody can get anything to enter an unemployment equation. So we're really in big new territory. The only thing we've ever been able to get to work, and in this paper we have there, I show you that the lagged home ownership enters a higher home ownership 5 years earlier. The higher is the unemployment rate. It's about the only thing that can work. So let's just look here. So go back. So if you look back at what I said in April 08, I should have done more of it, and I should have really realized that, in fact, if you sit in April 08, it was quite clear using the fear of unemployment data that told you that, if you just say, let's look at the peak and how far from the peak, the peak being that I have no fear, and then how does fear rise? This is a measure that the European Union produces monthly for every country. It's based on a question, what do you think is going to happen to unemployment? And you get a score. Well, it turns out that actually in many of these countries, the score had reached a low in early 07. So the UK had reached a low in October 07, in Sweden in October 07, in Portugal in January 07. In Germany, it doesn't get there till April 08, but this index, it turns out, is a pretty darn good indicator of what's coming. So in fact, what's pretty interesting, if you look at this series, if I take my fear of unemployment series and I track it against the fear of unemployment provided by representatives of manufacturing firms, look, the things track almost perfectly. They track each other. If people are saying the same things as employers are saying, even though macroeconomists are saying something completely different. Okay, I'm going to just go through here quickly. Oh, and lots of other measures are doing the same thing. So the Bank of England has scores on employment prospects. The PMIs say the same thing. There's lots of measures that turn out to say the same thing, that the fear of unemployment and expectations variables, and no matter what the source, if it's a purchasing manager index, it's the Bank of England scores, they all basically say the same thing, and they all give you a steer on what's coming. How am I doing for time, Matlow? How much have I got? I'm all right. I've got about 15
Yeah,
minutes.
you should be all right. Yeah,
I'm doing good. Okay, so the first thing is, right, so that turns out to be pretty good. The UK PMIs track it. So the simplest thing is this equation, and I do things separately by country and show you. But basically, if this is, so got 9,000 observations here, take the unemployment rate by month since 1985. So I've got monthly unemployment rates from 1985 to 2021 for 29 European countries. And I have their fear of unemployment variable. And I have lots of other kind of fear type unemployment variables. It doesn't really matter which you use. The fear of unemployment is the simplest. And obviously this fear variable, they ask people, so I go back, they ask people, what do you think is going to happen to the number of people unemployed in this country? Do you expect it to change over the next 12 months? Increase sharply, increase slightly, so on. Okay, so basically when you run this thing in an unemployment equation, you've got unemployment rate in month, year, country in T, and you've got a lag of that 12-month lag, so everything's in months, so it's a lag T minus 12 variable, and you can basically show that, put the fear of unemployment variable in there, state effects, sorry, year effects, country effects, everything moves. And you can't get anything much else at all. You can't get this, very hard to get anything else in the world to enter this equation. So the fear of unemployment works. And then we experiment. There's all sorts of things. What do you think about the economic situation? And so it turns out, and we put in this variable for industries, the same variable I just talked about, turns out that all of them enter significantly and help you predict the change in unemployment that's coming. So when you do that, when you use that, and we set this rule up, which is basically take this fear variable, look at its start, look at its change, and basically what you can show is that this predicts really well and early. So this predicts, for example, in Ireland, Q1 GDP growth in Ireland shows you the start of the recession in Q1 08. My rule tells you February 07. For Germany, let's see, for Germany, right, my rule gives you August 07 as a predictor of what's coming in 12 months. And the recession starts in Q2 08. So turns out this is doing a pretty darn good job, realizing that I knew it pretty well in April 08. But looking back, we could have done it for every one of these countries, and it called it pretty good. So the last thing I want to do is I want to go to the US and tell you about the call we're making today. So here's the story in the United States. Since 1980, there have been 6 recessions called by the NBER. So there's the thing called the NBER Business Cycle Dating Group. I understand there was one coming in Portugal. I'm sure Germany has such a thing, but people can tell me. But this is basically, so when are you going into recession? This seems like a crucial thing for policymakers, central bankers. We need to know this. And all we know is the macro was hopeless. I remember in August 2008, Olivier Blanchflower gave up an NBER paper called The State of Macro, and he said the state of macro is good because it's grounded in theory, but they made no mention that actually the US had been in recession since December 07, which is what NBER Business Cycle Group called it. So they called December 07, but they didn't call it until December 08. And if you look at GDP growth for reasons we've said, that's not bad, but we don't know it for 8 or 10 years. So you can't really go with that. And if you take the SARM rule, turns out the SARM rule always gets it late. The SARM rule, it gets it before the NBER basically gets it to you, but the SARM rule turns out to be worse. So I want to show you. So a couple of things you can do. You can actually we go through this new paper, and the second one, which is about the SARM rule. First thing you can do is, can you find 2 successive months of declines in employment? Turns out that's a pretty darn good rule. That's a better rule than the SARM rule, better rule than the NBER. And in fact, you can take non-farm payrolls or the CPS, and that gives you a pretty good steer. Or does the unemployment rate jump by 0.3? So from 5.2 to 5.5, that turns out to be a really darn good rule as well. And in fact, if you'd have looked at any of those things for the US, you'd have called the recession. Well, look, if you'd have used those things in December 07, you would have called the recession in the US, my method, both in July 07 or in November 07, but you'd have got it before the NBR. You got it a year ahead of the NBR, and you'd have got it ahead of the SAMA. Okay, but I want to show you this. So here's the big deal. So this is another index called, what do you think is going to happen to the economy? It's called the expectations index. And it turns out we have a number of things. We have this by month and year in the US, but I also have a new file, which is I have it by 8 states. So this is pretty darn good. And I can run the equivalent of those country year regressions. And if you look here, it turns out that my rule is just take the peak of these indices and see if that index drops from a peak, drops by 20 points. Turns out that's a pretty darn good rule. But it turns out also that if you go to September, we're going to call September 2021 using these data. And we're going to call it because these indices peaked in around March, April, May, June of this year. And they've plummeted since then. And I'm just going to show you one table to finish with. I've got lots of stuff there. And you can run the unemployment rate equations and you can get these conference board expectations to enter the unemployment rate. This is a monthly state year equivalent of what we've had before, 1,400 observations. I can show you that these expectations variables predict really well the unemployment rate, knowing that nobody else has got anything that enters an unemployment equation. I mean, nothing. I mean, zero. Okay, so let's just go with this. And I'm going to finish on this, but look here. So now we have data. We only have it from 2007, but we have data on the 8 biggest states in the United States, right? Knowing that the recession was called for December 07. So we can look back in 07 and say, well, what happened in this index? So my thing is look at the peak and then see, does it drop by 20 odd points since the peak? So if you look, so I've just given you the peak in California, it's 107.2, drops by, what is it? 36 points. Here it drops by 60 points. Here it drops by 30 points. Here it drops by only 3. Oh yeah, it drops by 12. It drops by 25 points here. It drops by 25 there. It drops by 40 there. And it drops by 25 there. So pretty darn much. If you took the data by these states, looked at their measures of the expectations index, found the peak, and then say, has it dropped by 25 points, which is the sort of rule we're operating, that turns out to be pretty darn good. Well, look here. Looky. The problem and why this is all such a big deal is the unemployment rate data is hopeless now. The wage data is completely hopeless. The wage curve is completely wrong in 2020 because the unemployment rate went from 3.5 to 20 in 6 weeks and wage growth quadrupled. So this is all a mess. Wages are a mess, unemployment's a mess. But here's this survey. So here's what we got. In each of these states, just like we had in 2007, these data peaked around March. So look, March in California, Florida, Illinois, New York, Pennsylvania, and Texas, a little earlier in Michigan, a little later in Ohio. But let's look at New York. So New York's index was 129. Ira, I told this was for you. 129 points, the state of New York, that is 129.2. It peaked in March. It's now down nearly 60 points. The only time we'd ever seen falls of that kind is when countries entered recession. So obviously I think this is a really big deal. And so I think, and there's other data we've just got out. I got data yesterday from Chris Williamson, who's at PMI, who's the guy at Market. Actually, I was listening to NPR last night and I was talking about this. And of course, the PMIs, it turns out, for consumer facing things have been collapsing. So this is all pretty darn good. I have a take that Jan Vlaj, ex-member of the NPC, discussed my book and argued that you shouldn't expect economists to be able to predict recessions. I actually say this is complete abject bloody nonsense. What's the point of having economists who forecast things if they can't forecast things? But anyway, he says that you shouldn't expect economists to forecast things, just like you shouldn't expect doctors to forecast heart attacks, which was actually pretty interesting to all my friends I have a whole series of friends of mine who are cardiologists who said, well, that's complete nonsense. Because every one of them does exactly that. And if you've ever been to your doctor, there's a thing called the Q-risk protocol. So you go into your doctor and you sit down and you fill all these things out and they calculate what's the probability of you having a heart attack, right? And if it's above something, they say, right, take statins. And if it's above something else, they say, stop smoking. And if it's above something else, they say, go to the hospital. Well, and that's exactly what doctors do. So I think I have previously argued that the usefulness of policymakers should not be measured by their ability to forecast recessions. Crap. I don't agree with that at all. Turns out the reason they say it is because they couldn't do it. But now I'm showing you actually that you can do it. So the 3 papers show you that we can predict the prior recessions in Europe. We can predict the thing in the UK. We can predict it in the United States. It turns out that everything started in the United States in 2007 and spread. Looks like in 2022, the recession has already hit, and the data will be a year or two before you get there. The data don't suggest that yet outside the US, although there's some signs of slowing. We had a thing in the UK 2 days ago by the director saying the biggest collapse in business confidence you've ever seen. And there is some evidence from PMIs and so on around the world that September is showing some slowing. So I think this is pretty exciting stuff. Slowing, using data that's about what people think. People seem to know it. And the reason we need to do this is because macroeconomics has been completely worthless in forecasting recessions or much of anything else. There you go, Matthew, how'd I do? Pretty cool stuff, you gotta admit. And
Really
different. I told Ira he would be depressed when I told him about New York.
Well,
he's got his
I
hands
suppose
up.
he's in New Jersey, so he's.
Yeah, I know, but if you're in New,
that.
I know he's in New Jersey. But
I know.
Door, right? New Jersey.
Thanks very much. That's really interesting and very fascinating stuff, Danny. Questions for Ira? For Danny, Ira?
I would normally go first, but I have been puned at Ira so many times that I think he has to be able to go first.
Yeah, he is. Ira?
I need you.
You're mute.
Down the bottom.
I was clapping. I hit the wrong icon.
Okay.
Klaus.
Yeah, Danny, very interesting stuff. And I agree that there's a huge potential in population sentiments data in general for predicting future. That is very obvious and becomes very nicely worked out. Now, when you talked, I just realized that, I mean, I knew about this 30 years ago. I read a paper by a German colleague, Gebhard Kirchgessner, and he put up a question by a famous German Institute for Opinion Research. Every year since 1949, they ask in December a question to the population: how do you feel for the next year? It's about the sentiment.
Right.
Well, now, and what he did is he correlated that, I mean, with regression, rational expectation ideologies framework, and he found out that the predictions coming out for the business cycle, yes, next year were better than all the institutes, research institutes.
Well, it's the same point, Klaus. It's the same point, right?
Perfectly. Yeah, I should give you the reference.
No, I would like that. I would like that.
Published 1985, so to speak, and updated later. Very interesting.
What's difficult here is in a sense this, and I'm worried about it a lot. So in a sense, what you saw at the big downturn in 2007 was that some of these series started to fall, right? And people said things like, "Oh, this has fallen before." And what I noticed was what has not happened before was that every series, no matter what its source, was all doing the same thing for every country, right? So if you think in April 2008, every single data source for every European country on this kind of stuff, no matter how you asked it, which sector it was in, right? Broader than what Klaus said, right? Everything moved together and they were all, and it was hard. It's in a way, it's hard to say, well, all 8 of them were saying, I mean, you go to the Bank of England scores and every one of the scores collapses. Never, in the past, you look at one, but you've never seen all of them moving together. So empirically, it's kind of hard, but I think Klaus is right. People knew this as a paper by Dick Curtin on the University of Michigan survey, but they didn't. Essentially, what's changed, Klaus, is that the Great Recession, right? Nobody really looked at this stuff and realized you should have. I mean, I said it in this speech, but the big thing is this big turning point. And the reason it's so become sexy and why I've done this is because the macro guys missed it. The central banks missed it by September 08, when Lehman Brothers fell. Neither the ECB nor the Bank of England nor the Fed had the faintest clue about what we've just talked about.
Well,
I mean, Ender had his hand up and then he put it down again, so I'm not going to let him put it down again.
Danny, I know that you are right. They didn't believe in it. We didn't expect the big decline. But I was sitting with Atlas here in the side building of the White House. The Friday before Lehman Brothers went down, and Ed was very relaxed. Yes, but there was an cyclical program. Yes, this before. Financing consumer demand at that year. Also in the summer of 2008, the IMF, I was in one of these worldwide media conferences, press conferences, and they were claiming, the IMF was claiming in the summer of 2008, long before September, that there would come a big decline in growth worldwide. Yes, so there was something going on. I mean, but the problem is that we didn't see the dramatic.
I agree with that. I agree, but I think
so your indicators must help us to understand the threat really. I mean, the big.
Right. The thing in a way which is interesting though is how similar the discussions are today as they were in spring of 2008. Remember, both at the Fed and on my committee. I mean, I voted on one meeting in I think it was June 2008, and I said, this is a disaster. I think I voted for a 50 basis point cut. And another member of the committee voted for a rate rise. And the same thing on the FOMC. During 2008, and you were in recession, there were people who voted for rate rises because inflation had picked up, right? Inflation was 5 by July 2008. And so what happened was, I mean, in a sense, let's interpret what Klaus said. They were watching the wrong things. Right, we're right about inflation. Inflation went from 5 to -2 in about 6 months. Right, same thing today. We should do things because inflation's so high. But the question is, well, my indices are telling you that that's not the right thing to focus on. So I agree, Klaus. But so Olivier Blanchard's point was, it's so great that macro is grounded in theory, but actually never mentioned anything about the real world at all. So I think those comments you made are very good, but those things were pushed aside, and your point is that we kind of knew it, and I agree with that. And you look back and there are papers that do this. I mean, the other thing is they said, well, why does this give you a bum steer? Are there occasions when these surveys get it wrong? And the answer is basically not. Essentially, there are not. I mean, by let's say May 2008, essentially every one of these series was at historic low levels. And remember that, that it took the NBR until December 2008 to call it for December 2007. So I think the answer is that if we should have gone back and read that German paper, and if you'd have read it, we wouldn't have missed it. So I agree with you, Klaus. But this is amazing, I think. Yes, others. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Ender had his hand up and then he put it down.
I'm just trying to kind of understand a little bit about, if I may ask the question, about this fear. If you mentioned this 2008, and I can distinctly remember this. In 2008, you actually you were in the minority voting for lowering the interest rate, and the Bank of England was, the overall, or whatever the majority was, to either keep it or raise it, as you said. And so there's this whole kind of policy steer coming out of Bank of England and macroeconomic kind of forecast that everything is great. And so are people who are being surveyed in terms of fear of unemployment, is it ignorance is bliss in a way they're not really paying attention to the policy that is coming out, these policy announcements and all is good? Or is it that they're saying we know better in a way at the micro level, at our, within our environment?
Can I answer that? Let me just give you this. I think the answer is that these policymakers are completely clueless. And so I've been listening, as I say, over the last week or so to things that FOMC bank presidents and basically bank presidents, and it's complete and total nonsense. They have absolutely no clue, and what they're saying is kind of entirely stupid. But so I would let me set you up, Matlu. So at the Bank of England, we would have sets of discussions. And we'd have a thing on a Friday, which is we go into Purda. And on Thursday of each week before a decision, we wouldn't be able to communicate with anybody. On Friday, we'd have a 3-hour presentation from the staff of the bank And then we talk about it on Monday and Tuesday, have a meeting on Wednesday, and set the decision on Thursday. And for a very long time, we had two sets of things that people were telling us. The first set were from economists and forecasters and policymakers who told us that inflation was a really big deal and there was no recession coming. And then in the last 15 minutes, we'd have the Bank of England's agents. And they'd report this, the chart that I showed you. And they reported this. So if you look, so if we look at this chart, this is the views of the Bank of England's agents. So now by 2008 Q2, we're at levels that have never been seen before. And at one point in a meeting, I said, it seems to me we spent 3 hours in this meeting, 2.5 hours with, 2 3/4 hours with these people who haven't the faintest clue, who were completely contradicted by the Bank of England's agents. I mean, the Bank of England's agents had it. They had it. There it is. It's published monthly. You can go to the website. That we knew that on that day. So the answer is that the professionals, and I said, the Bank of England's, the biggest problem with them is the Bank of England's agents have been beaten up by the economists to not believe the Bank of England's agents. And right, so I think the answer is that this reflects what people on the ground know. So this is, you got to talk to firms, you get a score. You talk to consumers, they know. People on the ground know. And if you use these data, it turns out that that's true. It's true, right? So I don't quite get it. And if you and the big deal, if you go at the Fed, you go and look at the beige book. And I look at the beige book, and the beige book almost always completely contradicts anything the bank presidents say. So the Cleveland Bank Fed president says something, you go read the stuff in the beige book about what's happening in the Cleveland Fed area. It's almost completely contradicted and almost always right. So I don't know, but it looks to me like the lady on the Clapham omnibus, now the Marlin Road omnibus, gets it, and economists don't. I mean, that's a big deal. Right? And you know it. So here's the data today. Danny's going to make a call. It's a non-consensus call. Who would you believe? Well, I can show you that I can call every recession that's gone before it. I called the Great Recession before everybody else. Every index I've got is right. And now I make a call. But I'm the only person who A, could call it, and B, called it a year before it happened and 2 years before everybody else. Yeah. Pretty amazing, right? Let me unshare it. But as I say, if you look at the next one, if you just looked at, supposing you would sort of say, I'm going to believe the PMIs. If you go back and you looked at the PMIs, the UK PMI said the same thing. Look, this is January 08. This is February 08. You don't get it until August. Well, look here. Construction, manufacturing, and services are completely consistent with the Bank of England agents, completely consistent with my fear data. And they tell you by February 08 you're in recession, when you haven't a clue. And in fact, the Bank of England makes a forecast in August 08 saying there's going to be no recession, even though you've been in recession since April. I mean, this is unbelievable failure, and I'm trying to get them out of it.
Any luck so far?
Well, I mean, I'm not, yeah, a bit. I mean, people have started to pay attention to this because how are you going to argue against it? Historically, I have the data, I can show you this. Can you do better than this? Nobody can do better than this.
Good. Any other questions, comments? Well, then we'll finish here, Danny. Thank you so much for really, really interesting and fascinating stuff. I'm sure there is around the world clapping going on.
So you can go to my website. The first two are on the website. This third one, Ender had his hand up, and so did Wolfram actually.
I think there's clapping.
They're
doing virtual clapping.
Okay. Oh, and there's a question on chat. Is that? Oh, thank you from Virginia. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you all, and please write to me if you think this is interesting, and I'm happy to send people the data. But I think this is a whole new area that potentially is a really big deal. I mean, we some of it we have the micro data for, some of it we don't. But this is publicly available data. Your students can download, and away you go. Yeah. I mean, why aren't we using this? So Klaus's point is a really good one. We knew this in the past. Why did we forget? And what happened was we got enamored by useless twiddly theory and by theoretical foundations of things that forgot about the real world. I got Ira to smile. All right. Thank you.
Good. Thanks very much. Thank you. Bye.